I am Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual policy forum, SDG Zero, a people-centered approach to universal connectivity. As the pandemic regrettably continues to rage in many parts of the world, we are already beginning to gather insights and lessons from what everyone recognizes has been a monumental global event. And among them is that the pandemic has dramatically accelerated our dependence upon digital technologies. At the same time, the pandemic has revealed and exacerbated the extraordinary social, economic, and political inequality in the world with deadly and long-term consequences. And this inequality translates into a yawning digital divide. Closing this divide is increasingly a shared priority among governments, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector. But real questions remain about how best to do it. It is not simply a matter of increasing connectivity, but doing so in a way that is sustainable and human-centered. Concerns to the right to privacy, cybersecurity, the spread of misinformation, hate speech, sexual exploitation, and among others are a necessary part of this equation. And so to address some of these issues, IPI, together with Microsoft's Office of UN Affairs, convened 3 roundtables this spring and produced a paper by my colleague Jimena Leiva-Roche that identifies the obstacles to universal connectivity and considers how they can be overcome, looking particularly at the human rights risks of rushing to close the digital divide and how these risks can be mitigated, all of which will be the subject of our conversation today. So allow me to take this quick moment to thank the UN team at Microsoft for this very productive partnership, in particular John Frank, who is here today, and Lonnie Cassette as well. And we look forward to continuing this work together. We have a great group here to discuss all of this, who I will introduce in a moment. And we should have plenty of time for Q&A. So those of you who are in the room in the webinar, you can please use the Q&A or the chat function at the bottom of your screen to introduce your questions, and we'll go through them later in the event. But first, we will have brief opening remarks from His Excellency, Mr. Munir Akram, Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the United Nations and 76th President of the UN Economic and Social Council, followed by Her Excellency, Ms. Valentine Rogoviza, Permanent Representative of Rwanda to the United Nations. Thank you. Welcome all. Ambassador Akram, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to speak at this event, which is organized by the IPI. And I would like to take this occasion to welcome the new head of IPI, my friend, Ambassador Princett. We are living through the greatest global crisis in 100 years. 3 million people have died, hundreds of millions infected by the virus. Most economies are in deep recession. 200 million jobs have been lost, and a decade of human development has been reversed. It is obvious that technology and innovation is a critical factor in both the present crisis we are facing, as well as a key to building back better from this crisis. But as has been revealed so vividly, there is accelerated inequality which has marked both the response to the pandemic and the prospects of recovery. The financial outlays that have been deployed for recovery are hugely unequal. $17 trillion in fiscal stimulus by the richer countries, and less than 100 billion that have been deployed so far to support developing countries. The advent of digital technologies has been instrumental in maintaining economic activity, human connection, human exchanges, and will play a large part in the prospect of building back better. But here too, in the digital space, the inequality between the richer countries and the poorer is astronomical. 83% of people in the richer countries are connected. They are online. They have been able to communicate, to conduct business, to have access to education, and the ability to live through life in the midst of this pandemic. In the developing countries, in the poorest countries, only 19% are connected. The rest of the developing world lives in virtual darkness, so to speak. And therefore, digitalization and bridging this digital divide, it will be critical in bringing them back into a global economy, which is increasingly powered by the force of digitalization. Without connectivity, the prospects of developing countries being able to compete economically in trade and production will be quite dismal, as will be the prospects of their people having access to knowledge, to education, and all the connections that are required in order to participate in an increasingly interdependent and connected world. I think the realities are well known, and the positive and negative aspects of digitalization are also quite visible to all of us. We need a coherent and strategic response to the digital space. A coherent response in the sense of prioritizing, first and foremost, the objective of bridging the digital divide, which will require huge investments in digital infrastructure, in cables, in data centers, in platforms, in service providers located across the world, especially in the developing countries. The examples of developing countries having entered the digital space and successfully operating in that space are also there. There are the Singapores of the world, even in China, huge acceleration has taken place in coping and entering into the digital space. The rest of the developing countries need to catch up, and there is huge demand and huge opportunities for investment in this space. The policies that we need to evolve will not happen through interactions only among member states. The 70% of the ownership of digital technologies is held by a handful of private companies. And these private companies are largely located in only 2 countries. And therefore, we need to involve all of them. They can, and it is feasible to involve all of them in a multi-stakeholder approach to promoting the digitalization of the global economy. Of course, in our response, we must take into account the dark side of the web, as the Secretary General has called it the fourth horse of the apocalypse. And that too is visible to all of us. The threats of cyber security, cyber crime, terrorism, hate speech, ingress into privacy, the ownership of data, all of these are issues that need to be addressed in evolving policy and governance in this digital space. So the proposal from the IPR with regard to a human-centric approach to digitalization is timely, both in terms of expanding the positive spaces in digital technologies, as well as in addressing its negative aspects. One other issue that needs to be taken into account is that technology and digitalization is also now at the center of global tensions between the great powers. While we seek to bridge the North-South digital divide, it is also important to prevent an East-West division of the world into competing digital worlds. And the task, therefore, that is before us in addressing the digitalization challenge is huge in scope and its impact. And it is important that we bring together all these efforts into one coherent space. I welcome the work of the the Internet Governance Forum and the establishment of the open-ended working group. And I hope that your deliberations will add an important aspect of aligning the digitalization of the world with the sustainable development goals. I wish you all success. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador. We will now turn directly to Her Excellency, Ms. Valentine Rogovisa, Permanent Representative of Rwanda to the United Nations. Ambassador, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Good morning to all and to all friends that I see here on the screen. Let me just very briefly say that, start by saying thank you to you, IPI, for organizing today's event on a people-centered approach to universal connectivity. This is an approach that we have taken as Rwanda from the start on. It is and it has been from the beginning our strong belief that we cannot actually achieve inclusive development without connecting, without inclusive digital integration of all people. So this is a strong belief, but also it is not only a belief, we have experienced that. Our achievements in terms of development have been very much led by connectivity and digital inclusion of all. It is also our strong belief that when it comes to the SDGs, during this decade of action, we will actually not be able to achieve the SDGs, to accelerate the SDGs without accelerating the connectivity, without connecting everybody. That it is, we are strongly convinced of that. And in all SDGs, be it health, be it education, be it climate protection. Now, let me go back to what we are really more discussing today. As I said, this has been our approach from the beginning, that for us, building an inclusive digital economy is a core pillar of our economic, of our development, inclusive development. It has been a people-centered approach. We consider universal connectivity to really be a lever for accelerating growth, equitable and fast service delivery, and employment creation. As you all know, my president is the co-chair of the Broadband Commission. So this is and has been for many years now. The interesting part of the Broadband Commission as well, among the many things they do, it's really that it is this multi-stakeholder commission. It was understood from the very beginning that we will never be able to achieve universal connectivity without having the industry, the private sector, and the governments, the policymakers on board working together. We all have gone and Ambassador Munia brilliantly explained all the impacts we have gone through during this pandemic. But this pandemic also showed us one incredible opportunity, is that we actually have, during the last year, we've seen an uptake and an acceleration of the digital transition. So we know that we don't need another pandemic to really build on that and to pick up. So it is possible. We know that it has been possible in incredibly hard conditions and environment. And I really hope that today in this conversation, we will hear from all of you and from the experts. What is it that we have learned from that? I can tell you on our side what we have done in terms of Rwanda, what we actually have learned. I'm also very happy to see that among the panelists who speak later here, there is a representative of GIGA. Because GIGA is precisely one of the initiatives we enter into, one project we entered into. Why? Because, well, a large part of the children were put off school completely, off education. And it was clear to us that we really need that connectivity to cover all the schools, regardless of where they are, in rural or urban areas, to cover all the schools. And you will speak to that, is the expert on that. Rwanda is one of the African countries to be part of this project. So that is one of the things that we did. But also in terms of services, access to services, when you look at the financial services, just overnight, it was no longer possible to go for people to go to banks or to local entities for to access their resources. And for overnight, we really moved into cashless operations, and the uptake has been incredible. It has grown by more than 10 times. I know I sound very optimistic, but I'm deliberately focusing on the opportunities side, because quite honestly, we have all suffered the cost. But let's just make sure that this incredibly painful crisis doesn't go to a waste when it comes to universal connectivity, because we also know that it will simply not be possible to achieve any of the SDGs without that. We also know by experience that today, leaving no one behind means actually leaving no one offline. People who are, and we have experienced in the last 18 months that people who are offline are off society. They are not seen, they are not heard, they are not registered. There is none of their data anywhere. So, and again, I will end with one specific part, because in your note, you focused on the COVID part, the COVID response. In terms of the COVID response, well, we didn't have the vaccines. We are still lacking the vaccines up to today. But the reason we have been able to handle reasonably well our response has to do a lot with using the data for prevention, using all the data that was available to prevent, to anticipate where there were going to be hotspots of spread, and using that data, but also using the drones to send the information, the accurate and reliable information, send the messages to the people, using the drones also to, when the tests were finally available, to get the test to people all over the country. And so the connectivity has been a huge part of what actually allowed us to reduce the impact and to respond in such a way that without having the vaccines, without having the large workforce, we also use robots in partnership with UNDP. We acquire robots not because we are such we find them so fancy, but we acquire robots to protect our limited healthcare workforce. Because with that we were able to do massive screening of temperature, have them in airports, and then be able really to answer. So let me end it here, just to say that, well, if let us see what are the partnerships we need to pick up on, and one key element we cannot forget, it is literacy. We need to invest hugely in skills, in the digital skills. Even a country such as Rwanda, where we have covered with all the hardware, the entire country, while we're still challenged when it comes to the skills. We need to build the skills so that people can connect and we can close that gap. And of course, the skills are lacking the most with the women and the girls. So let me end it here. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm seeing a lot of our major themes emerging here in these opening remarks. We have got a lot to talk about. In the interest of time, I'm going to move straight to the view from the Secretary General's office with Ayaka Suzuki, who is Director of Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. Ayaka, thank you. Please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation today. And well, congratulations to both IPI and Microsoft for this publication. When I read it, I really felt that it was a companion piece to the report of the high-level panel on digital cooperation, as well as Secretary General's own follow-on roadmap on digital cooperation. I mean, obviously, we can't overemphasize the centrality of connectivity, but it was already eloquently elaborated on both, well, in the paper itself, but you, Adam, as well as ambassadors of Pakistan and Rwanda. So I won't belabor the point itself because everybody who's tuning in knows this already. And much has already been said about how inequality has manifested itself in so many ways after the outbreak of COVID-19. But you know, what we have been really focused on the more or less the immediate impact. But what worries us is what's going to happen now in the recovery process, as Ambassador Akram has already alluded to. In order to build back better, we cannot allow for this inequality to remain entrenched. And so this is really a key piece of recovery process and building back better. And without universal connectivity, it will just simply entrench existing inequality, and that is not a world that we want to go to. And as Rwandan ambassador just said, we cannot waste, so to say, the crisis, which was to really a wake-up call for all of us. I also wanted to just take this opportunity to recall the UN 75 declaration, which was adopted by the General Assembly last September, which invited the Secretary General to revert to the General Assembly on the future of multilateralism. What future of multilateralism that's fit for purpose in addressing the challenges that we face today and of course tomorrow. And that will be done roughly along the 12 thematic areas that are in the resolution. What's become very clear in working on this as the Office of the Secretary General is that digital is very much a central piece, a common thread in all of these thematic areas. So for example, we can't talk about leave no one behind without the connectivity piece, right? We can't talk about, I mean, as I've just been saying now, inequality without that, and protecting planet, so on and so forth. So it really, the prominence of the importance of this topic has become even more pronounced as 15 months into the crisis. I'm glad that Chris will be discussing the GIGA project, which was already mentioned by the Rwandan ambassador. I mean, we are fully supportive of this as one concrete example of translating the idea of universality into action. But I mean, really much more needs to be done at this stage. And I also wanted to stress that connectivity is not just about infrastructure. I mean, as mentioned already, it is about skill sets. It's also about language that are being used in the internet. It's right now, it's still very limited, right? It's not even remotely close to the number of languages that exist in the world. So again, the beyond the infrastructure, we need to really start paying attention to these things as well. And also, I am very heartened that some member states are now beginning to think about multilateral alliances for open data sharing, things like that. So because again, it goes beyond once everybody's connected, what's going to happen, right? So considering these aspects of it, I mean, there are new public goods that are emerging that we need to be thinking about. We need to make sure that it's available and accessible to everybody equally. So I would just like to conclude by saying that that diagnosis period is over. I think this policy brief has pretty much set the tone and laid out the situation and then also offer very concrete examples and ideas to move forward. So I would really like to, I would like to hope that it'll really kickstart the process of translating the idea of universal connectivity to reality. And as Chris will speak to later, I mean, GIGA is one very, very good example, which I'm sure more people will support, but much more is needed. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Ayaka. I know that your time is tight, so really appreciate your insights there. Thank you for the nice words on the policy note. I should say the author, Jimena Leiva, is not here today because she is on maternity leave, but we will communicate. I'm sure she's probably watching because she's someone who just continues to work no matter what. But we're really pleased with her excellent work on this. So thank you, Jimena, if you are watching, or when you watch, because I'm sure you will at some point. We will now turn to Brian Kariuki, who is the director of Mawingu Networks and director on the Futures Advisory Board at UAP Old Mutual Kenya, and in an operational capacity as Vice President for Digital and Financial Services at Copia Global. Brian, please, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Adam. Greetings to everyone participating in this forum today and to everyone watching out there. So the publication on which this discussion today is based focus quite a bit on the human rights risks involved in closing the digital divide, and concluded that in order to achieve meaningful and sustainable progress towards digital inclusion, that all actors need to play a part. So what I'd like to do today is to give the voice of one of the actors that certainly needs to play a part, and that is the last mile internet service provider, the people who put into place the infrastructure that enables people to come online. And that's what Mawingu Networks is. I'm speaking to you today from Nanyuki, which is a town about 3 hours north of Nairobi in Kenya. And this is where Mawingu Networks is based, from where we serve several 100,000 customers across this nation of Kenya in different parts. And Mawingu really started out as a grant-funded project to test the use of certain innovative technologies to connect in the last mile people in remote areas, and I mean really remote areas, right? So not just rural, but deep rural. And at some point, this was in 2012, and shortly after, it became clear that there was actually an opportunity for there to be a sustainable commercial business that does precisely this kind of work. Since then, we have served, as I said, several 100,000 customers for as little as 10 US cents a month, which enables those customers to have access to life-changing connectivity. And when I talk about that price point, the sorts of customers we have, as I said, live in remote areas. A typical customer is one of our customers in an area called Isiolo, which is not too far from here, who lives in a mud house. His house is literally a mud hut. He doesn't have, he's off the grid in terms of power. He doesn't have running water, but he does have an internet connection, which he powers through his solar unit, right? So these are the types of people who see the need for connectivity. And really, when we talk about bridging the digital divide, this is a big part of it. A big part of it is connecting such people who otherwise would not have access to connectivity. It's also about connecting people who have traditionally been left out, which is women. And one of the speakers before me has spoken about the need for us to drive equality. And one of the things we have found at Mawingu is that even while we work to increase equity of the internet access, we need to have efforts running in parallel to guarantee equality in participation. Because what is happening in this part of the world is that even while more and more people are going online, the majority of those benefits are accruing to men as opposed to women, such that 30% of internet users in this area, those who are fortunate enough to be connected, only 30% of them are women. So what is happening is that the historical socioeconomic exclusion of women in the analog world is now being replicated in the digital space. And this is absolutely something that needs to be looked at. And at Mawingu, we have done quite a bit of work in this area and proven interventions that are effective at addressing the barriers to equality of participation, equality of digital participation. And some of those interventions include data costs. The same data costs, same cost of data does not mean that all people can participate, because some are historically socioeconomically excluded. Some of those interventions revolve around the content that we make available and that is adapted to specific local needs and delivered through digital channels. Some of those interventions revolve around creating safe spaces where the journey from offline to online can be undertaken without the sort of typical cultural barriers that exist. Now, we've been fortunate to participate in that kind of work, but fundamentally, what Mawingu exists to solve is this issue around exclusion and exclusion of people in rural areas. And in our work, we have realized that a couple of fundamental sort of things have come across. One of them is that, and I'd like to highlight two. One of them is that Western connectivity models will not get Africa online. I say that because if you look at one of the best measures of quality internet access, which is broadband connections per every 100 people in the population. In Europe, for instance, there are about 40 broadband connections for every 100 people. That figure for sub-Saharan Africa sits at slightly under 1 connection for every 100 people. And if the models that were used to get Europe online were replicated, and many Western nations were replicated to Africa, this would require upwards of $2 trillion to be expended. Now, that sort of resourcing might not be available anytime soon. that creates the opportunity for organizations such as Mawingu who are interested in closing this digital divide. And what we have done at Mawingu is created an innovative technology and commercial solution that revolves around the provision of fixed wireless internet, right? And essentially what fixed wireless internet does is it extends the reach of fiber connectivity. Deploying fiber is expensive, but with fixed wireless internet, using low-cost radio equipment and lighter infrastructure than mobile, which can be erected rather quickly, we are able to extend the coverage of last mile internet connectivity to beyond 100 kilometers from a fiber line. And that number beyond 100 kilometers is important because really the numbers tell us that 60% of Africans live within 25 kilometers of a fiber line in terms of how the population is constituted. So this really is a technologically viable solution. The question is it commercially viable? Which comes back to this discussion we're having today, which is where the rubber meets the road with the recommendations of this publication that has been made is with whether organizations such as Mawingu are able to operate in a sustainable manner. And the answer is that in order to connect rural areas sustainably, we need to find innovative financing models. One that has become quite popular, at least people speak about quite a bit, is around blended finance, right? Now, where essentially we make use of non-commercial funding and commercial funding to enable organizations such as Mawingu to connect people in the last mile. Now, interestingly, as Ambassador Rugwabiza has earlier stated, COVID is actually an opportunity, but a perishable opportunity, because at some point we'll get over it, hopefully. Therefore, that opportunity is perishable. To accelerate the actualization of what has been referred to as SDG Zero, which is universal connectivity. And I say that because what has happened is that COVID has already caused users, the people who drive demand for connectivity, being private sector players, individuals, and also state actors, to prioritize connectivity amongst the many things that compete for their resources, as the ambassador has so eloquently put a few minutes ago. However, while the demand is there, the question is whether the supply in terms of the resources that are available to enable connectivity to be deployed to those places exists. And really, my call to action to the group today and to everyone listening is that what COVID needs to do is to unlock access to non-commercial resources to enable providers such as ourselves reach currently unserved areas. And this discussion that we are taking could result in one of two things. The first is that we could continue to declare commitment to universal connectivity, but be unwilling to change the models that avail resources to organizations such as Mawingu, right? And perhaps only do so too late, in which case we would have arrived too late, COVID will have gone away, and people would have gone back to prioritizing the things they were prioritizing before COVID. Hopefully that does not happen, because the alternative is that the organizations and the people having these discussions can accelerate the work to adapt the traditional processes for availing resources so that we can meet the challenge now, today. And we have found that there are some people who have begun to do that and some organizations that have begun to do that. And we are having some, we are in discussion with them. However, we have also found that some organizations that typically avail capital to to people such as ourselves or businesses such as ourselves that are in the business of rolling out infrastructure are moving too slow. And that really is a call to action, and that is where the rubber meets the road for this discussion. Thank you, Adam.
Excellent. Thank you. I was just thinking as you were speaking there that I lost track of how much of time because I was so engrossed with what you were saying. Really, so much to respond to there, and I encourage all the panelists that later when we have the Q&A to feel free to engage and ask questions. I mean, the perspective of the last mile internet providers, to say, is really enlightening. Thinking about this individual that you pointed to that has no power, no running water, but understands the need for connectivity. And I think that highlights what we're talking about. The connectivity, digital connectivity in today's world is a baseline. It's something that is really a need and something that we need to advance. But also, I take your point it's very important, and it was raised earlier, that it's not just about the infrastructure. It is also about the barriers to inclusion. And thank you for being the first to raise the issue of gender. I think that's really important. And as the ambassador said, it's also about capacity, skills. You raised the issue of cost, it's content, it's the need for safe spaces. These are all issues that need to be addressed in order to really bring universal connectivity. But then, of course, your insights on the infrastructure are really fundamentally important. And I find, as a non-technical person, the idea of fixed wireless internet is fascinating to me. But of course, it requires innovative financing, and I think that's a really good segue to our next speaker. We're fortunate to have here Professor Antonio Garcia Cevallos, lead specialist on telecommunications from the Inter-American Development Bank. Professor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you very much to the International Peace Institute as well as Microsoft for having me here. The presentation or the remarks that I'm going to talk about, I am trying to look at the things from a different view. Nowadays, nobody denies about the importance of connectivity for socioeconomic development. But let's talk about that something else that needs to be done. So let's talk about particularly 4 challenges that we are identifying at the IDB, at the Inter-American Development Bank, and what are the call for action for each of those 4 challenges that we are identifying. First one, and I think that almost all the panelists were mentioning before, is the funding. So only, for instance, in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, we have estimated a digital gap of around $69 billion that needs to be somehow, covered in such a way that we can reduce the gap between Latin America and the OECD country. From where this money is going to come, we had to, be aware that private sector is not going to be able to afford all such a big number, and there is a specific role for the public sector. And along this line, we have been talking about innovative financial models. So in here, I would say that probably the first innovative financial model is to bring the multilateral development banks and just allow a sort of coordination across all the MDBs to make sure that whatever interventions that we are doing in the countries are somehow aligned with the objective of universal digital services across the different countries in which we are providing support. So in this particular regard, models such as thematic bonds related to specific issues related to digital, encouragement of infrastructure deployment is going to be something very, very important. But we have to keep in mind that the private sector is not going to be able to cope with such amount of resources that are needed. And then we have to bring the public role, and we need to have some sort of coordination across the different institutions that are going to be involved, particularly the MDBs. The second one is the sustainability. And this one is very much interlinked to the issue of funding. So here we are talking about all the time about the importance of connectivity. That is definitely, no question, that is a very big challenge that everywhere around the world is having. But let's think what after. And what after is precisely the sustainability. And let me just bring you a real example that we are facing in two separate countries in Central America and Latin America. The issue of challenges is having two specific dimensions. One is precisely how to make that investment and that infrastructure sustainable from an economic standpoint. So the multilateral development banks are providing those resources for a certain period of years, 5 years, and what is happening after. So what is happening after is that the ministries that are going to be involved, the government at the end of the day, will need to allocate some resources to make sure that the services are guaranteed and the continuity of those services are guaranteed. So this implies that there are some specific resources coming from the Minister of Finance that has to be allocated to the different sector ministries to make sure that those schools that we are going to be connected, that those health centers that we are going to be connected, they will remain connected after the period of support from the NDBs has passed. And this comes with another type of sustainability, which is not economically, is institutional sustainability, which again implies that we have to make sure that there is a cross-cutting coordination across the different ministries within the same government in such a way that they understand what is coming with precisely the importance of digitalization. The third challenge is nothing but a consequence of the first two, which is the data. We have been talking a lot about the data, data protection, ID protection. So at the end of the day, having a more digital world implies to have more level of exposure to information that is flowing across that infrastructure. So there is here a whole issue related to regulatory frameworks that needs to be defined by the governments to reassure the users that whatever information that they are putting up there in the network is somehow not compromised. But at the same time, we will need a specific legislation or regulation to make sure that digital infrastructure becomes a critical infrastructure for the government. So I mean, nowadays we haven't been paying a lot of attention to the telecom services and the telecom infrastructure as a critical infrastructure for a country, at least in Latin American and the Caribbean countries. So we need to revert that particular situation, making sure first we have a clear identification of the critical infrastructure, and second, we have a proper legislation in terms of critical information infrastructure protection that is coming along. And last but not least, Ambassador Valentin from Rwanda was mentioning the issue of skills. So just to give you a quick example, 50% of the population in Latin America are women, but only 30% of the population working in the labor market are women. So there is just a clear gap in terms of how we could make the woman be part of the labor market by means of increasing the level of understanding of the digital skills and how to make sure that the population that eventually are going to be benefiting from having access to connectivity, could eventually be part of the labor force and can contribute to the economic growth of the country. I leave it here. I'm sure that there will be further opportunities to discuss. Thank you very much for the opportunity once again.
Great, excellent. Thank you. As a moderator, I always appreciate a concise list. 4 challenges: funding, sustainability, data, and skills, of the need to address each one of those systematically and holistically. And one of the things that one theme that I think comes out of your work, as in all the others, is how critically important this is to be understood as a multi-stakeholder challenge, that it's about public-private partnership and bringing everybody on board. So thank you for that. We are now moving on to back to the United Nations to hear from Scott Campbell, who is Senior Human Rights Officer at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Scott, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam. Excellencies, colleagues. My thanks to IPI and to Microsoft for inviting our office to the roundtable discussion. I think so timely and so important, given the many links between realizing universal connectivity and realizing the full range of human rights for all, and in parallel, advancing progress towards the SDGs. Given that the time is short, and Adam, thanks for the the noting of being clear and concise. I'll make just 3 points. I'll jump in right away, and hopefully we'll make points that build on what's already been said. The first is the importance of how we frame our approach to reaching connectivity. And I think the IPI issues paper that was shared with us touches on this point, and I really do think it warrants emphasizing. The author, Ms. Leva, she notes that among the many challenges facing us in efforts to advance connectivity is getting the framing right, and the framing in terms of how we're developing approaches and solutions to the connectivity challenges. And from our perspective, this holds true whether connectivity efforts are being made by member states, by companies, by the United Nations, or by some combination thereof. The IPI paper notes, I think very appropriately, that addressing the challenges requires a human-centered, human rights-based approach, and connectivity comes with risks, including privacy issues, misinformation and hate speech, online violence, sexual harassment. And while discussions on universal connectivity have gained momentum, these human rights considerations have often remained an afterthought. So my first point, as she alludes to, is that we go beyond people-centered and make sure that approaches to universal connectivity go hand in hand with the human rights-based approach and include strategies for protecting, respecting, and fulfilling human rights online and building capacity for cybersecurity. I think the question really to be asked here is, what are we connecting people to? Are they gaining access to new economic opportunities, expanded freedom of expression, freedom of association? Or are we connecting people to networks where they'll be victims of surveillance, exploitation of their data and privacy, victims of incitement, disinformation? Ultimately, I think if human rights are an afterthought, challenges such as privacy, cyber attacks, hate speech, and others will continue to grow and will compete with the many benefits that we all hope connectivity will bring. My second point ties in with this first one and addresses some of the questions posed to us about what concrete measures can be taken. And here I would underscore the need for human rights due diligence to be carried out, both by states and companies, as well as by the United Nations, and in particular, when developing and implementing connectivity projects. I should note that, of course, companies have human rights due diligence responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Member states have their obligations, and the Secretary General of the UN, though, has also called for the United Nations to develop its own human rights due diligence policy for its own development, use, and partnerships related to digital tech. I won't get into the details of human rights due diligence now, and perhaps in the discussion we can touch on that, but just to note, it does entail carrying out upstream as well as ongoing impact assessments to identify human rights risks on the full range of human rights, involving communities in transparent processes to design connectivity projects, to monitor their implementation, and to ensure that discrimination and exclusion of marginalized communities is avoided. Human rights due diligence also involves taking preventive and mitigating measures to avoid negative human rights impact, and making sure that there's ultimately access to remedy. My third and final point, which I'll make very quickly, is just that once communities are connected, I think we also need to consider how to maintain connectivity, and in particular, how to avoid internet shutdowns. And I think it's important to make the link to the economic and the social impacts of shutdowns and how shutdowns directly contradict the commitments of the SDGs. And I think in short, it makes little sense to commit to internet access for all, for big development investments made in infrastructure when there is a possibility of switching off access at will, with all of the negative impact that can have on business, small and large, access to healthcare, humanitarian aid, etc. So we would propose that international cooperation and aid that is seeking to expand connectivity includes explicit references to preventing internet shutdowns. And this would be, including in licensing agreements, and that imposed shutdowns should be reflected in indicators on the human rights and development situation of a country. Be happy to get into some of that later during this discussion, but for now I'll leave it at those 3 points. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris. That's fantastic. I mean, to make really the strong point that people-centered means not just going from a people-centered to really a human rights centered approach, because we need to be ensured that we're not connecting people only to be victims of surveillance or hate speech or other all the vulnerabilities, and that requires private sector, public, everyone to do their human rights diligence, not just upstream, but also ongoing. I think this point about doing ongoing impact assessments is extremely important. And then your final point about avoiding imposed internet shutdowns, I think is very, very important. Our final speaker on our panel has been referenced numerous times already today, so we're really happy to have Chris Fabian here, who is a global technology executive who co-founded Giga, a partnership with UNICEF and ITU to structure billions of dollars of financing to deliver affordable connectivity rather ambitiously to every school in the world, a really wonderful goal that we all share. And I should also say that in the context of the roundtable, we have Chris to thank for the term SDG Zero, which is really, really grateful in that. I think that really makes the point that we've been discussing, that this is connectivity really is sort of a baseline a goal that is required for so much work. All the SDGs in some sense could be seen as dependent upon improved connectivity. And Ayaka actually mentioned that it sort of threads through all the 12 themes of the UN 75 agenda as well. Great. So Chris, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Adam. Well, and Giga owns the domain names for SDG Zero, so we'll be auctioning them off to pay for school connectivity at some point. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it was great to read the report and to have all of the talking points that I might have had taken and presented in much smarter and more eloquent ways by the speakers who came before me. So I'm very, very happy to go last. I guess I'd want to make just one point, Adam, which I'll make in several different ways to really, round it out. But the one point is, if you can't see something, you can't fix it. And I think that's true in everything that we do in life. And it's just very fundamental. We don't know how many schools there are in the world. We think there are about 6 million, but we have no idea, which is an incredible fact to me. We don't know how much money it will take to connect every school in the world. We think it's around $420 billion US, but that number could also be off by an order of magnitude, could be trillions. We don't know how many young people are disconnected. We know there are about 3.5 billion people who aren't connected to a good internet. And you can argue about whether that's 1 gigabit per day or 2 gigabits or no gigabit, whatever that is. But we know that about half of the world is really not getting access to the type of net that we need to do business. And we know that 1 billion of those are young people, the people who will be working, building, and constructing the future for all of us. So there's a disconnect there, but we don't know where they are. And Giga is an initiative that was set up by UNICEF and ITU to try to address this issue. Giga works in 3 ways, and this is a partnership between these 2 UN agencies, but working with many others outside. First of all, we have a team of people who looks at mapping and understanding what the issues actually are. I'll put 2 links in chat, so if you would like to see what I'm talking about in real time, you can look at those. And if you look at Project Connect, there's a group of people working to map every school in the world. So far, we've mapped 1 million schools, 1.1 million, out of we don't know how many. And in countries like in Colombia, when we did the mapping, we found about 7,000 schools that didn't exist at a national level in national registers, which is incredible, but that's what happens in every country in the world. There's schools that are missing. And schools represent learning, represent communities, and you can use them to see connectivity as well. In addition to mapping, the team also looks at how connected a school is. You can obviously get information. Once you know where the school is, you can see if it's good, if it's well connected, if it's not well connected. And you can do that in real time because the internet allows you for that real-time monitoring, which is exciting. And you can see in some countries that there's tremendous sort of swaths of school, areas of school coverage that just don't have any internet at all. If you look at the Amazon in Brazil, in the Amazonas region, you'll see many of the schools there don't have connectivity. And you can look at that map and see that live in real time. The second part of Giga looks at the financing. Again, if you can't see it, you can't do anything with it. And as we heard from earlier panelists, that money exists. The money, the $428 billion or the $1 trillion exists. It's just not well syndicated. It's just not well lined up. It's hard to find deal flow, like the small ISPs, the last mile connectivity providers. It's hard to bundle them up in a way that's appealing to the investor who wants to put in $1 billion, $2 billion. It's just hard to make that due diligence work at scale. And it's hard to figure out how to get the big money from the IFIs and the DFIs to work at the right time frame and with the right kind of restrictions and costs and so on to line up with what governments need. So the second part of GIGA looks at the finance. And there we have a team of people who have worked, for example, with the government of Niger, with Western Balkans, and with the government of Brazil to start mobilizing now about $400 million in existing money. It's tiny compared to the amount we need. But 400 million is at least a beginning of getting those muscles working to start lining up that money, lining up the speeds and the costs of it. And of course, most of that money has to be private and institutional investment money. It can't be, this kind of charity type of approach when you're talking about such a large amount. And then the last part of GIGA looks at the tendering itself. So if you can see the schools and where the need is and you have the money, you need to be able to action that somehow with a contract. Otherwise, you're just having fun somewhere playing with bank accounts. We've done in the last 2 months issuance of tenders in Rwanda, in Sierra Leone, and in Kazakhstan, where we're testing out what happens once you have that real-time map and you have a little bit of money, when you can link delivery of results, connectivity of a school to payment. And that's when it gets really exciting for the providers, like what we just heard, like these last mile providers who they say up on top of the mountain, the school far away, the school in the desert, it's going to cost a lot more because there's no electricity there. And you can say, well, here's a contract. Contract says once you turn that dot green, once there's connectivity, you'll get paid. And you'll get paid more if it's up in a mountain or if it's out in the desert or if it's 40 kilometers from fiber. And if it's closer, you'll get paid less. But you won't get paid if the dot doesn't turn green. And you can do all of that in real time. And you can suddenly have real accountability, which is what I would like if I'm investing money, what a government wants. If you're a minister of finance who has these P&L centers in different ministries and you want to see that things are getting connected. And if you're a service provider, you want to know that you'll get paid fairly for the work that you do. So those are the 3 parts of GIGA. We're active in 19 countries. Governments like the government of Rwanda are helping to lead the charge and to share this work with other countries around them. And I think that overall, we try to keep this focus on the people who are otherwise not getting connected through regular means, the most disconnected people, the bottom quintile of people economically. And if I could, Adam, just two quick examples, and then I'll wrap up because I know we're running out of time. But I think that in order to catalyze this $400-odd billion, we need something big and something aspirational. UNICEF and ITU through GIGA are proposing a connectivity bond, a la the vaccine bond that Gavi and IFM set up in the early 2000s. This $5 billion instrument would look at helping to quickly take donor money, and this could be from either governments that have a good credit rating or companies, and there are two US companies, cough, Microsoft, that have the right credit rating to be able to underwrite something like this, to be able to make a commitment over the long term. But that commitment would be to building out public infrastructure. And the proceeds from that bond would be used to invest in the type of projects that I've described. And we believe that kickstarting, and if it's 5 billion, it's only a small layer of that whole thing, that kickstarting, that catalytic capital will do for connectivity what Gavi and IFM did for the vaccine market in the early 2000s. The second piece I'd add is that we can't just build the old internet again. Like the internet that we use is a pretty terrible place in a lot of ways. If it was a physical building, you would not send your kids into that building. There are a lot of dark areas, and there's a lot of horrible stuff that happens. When we talked to President Masisi of Botswana 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about all the work that's happening in Southern Africa, he said he believes that GIGA and this work is building up the new digital ports for his country, for a landlocked country. And we heard the same thing from our colleagues in Rwanda and elsewhere. And those ports have to connect to something that's better than the system we have now. It can't be about sending container ships full of junk from one place to another. And that means that you have to have local industry, local entrepreneurship, and local jobs that come in this digital economy. And I'll just end by saying, if you bring 1 billion young people online, and they come into a digital economy that's fair, that's built with local startups, that create local opportunities for finance and fintech and engagement in games and learning experience that don't all come from one city or a few cities that push out tech products around the world, but these are actually locally built, you change the way the technology works and serves humanity. And you get out of this East-West divide that we heard about at the very beginning, and you start to talk about locally generative communities of digital opportunity. And that's what's really exciting to us about GIGA at the end of the day. So it's just a pleasure to be here, and it was great to read the report. And we really look forward to helping to fill that circle in the middle of the SDG hole. That's why we called it a zero, because a big hole there. If you don't fill that hole, the rest of them don't happen. And we're sure of that. So thanks again, Adam, and thanks to the other panelists.
Great, thank you so much. Really is so much rich material here to discuss. We've got about 20 minutes, and for those who are in the webinar, I do encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat box. We've got a few that I'll throw out now, but we should have time for at least a second round. First, one question actually specifically. Well, I'll just throw out a few, and then I'll come back. So one question from our audience is directly for Scott, and it asks, what do you think human rights treaty bodies and the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights can do together to address the human rights implications impact of business social media activity? Then a question on funding and sustainability. Brian, you mentioned that you're able to do your contracts for as little as 10 cents a month. How do you do that, and is that a model that's transferable elsewhere? Is the cost of the fixed wireless significantly less expensive than the broadband and such that you mentioned? And actually, maybe not for Brian, but for others, another question related to that is we talked quite a bit about the remote areas, rural, but of course, one of the things we're experiencing, and this is relevant for the schools, is of course inequality of accessibility in urban areas as well. I'm situated in New York, and the issue around the schools, of course, was really dramatic about the fear of so many children being left behind, because even though they're in the middle of the richest city in the world, they don't have connectivity at home. So how can we address that? And one, I'm gathering questions from so many different places. Well, and one other question actually is in the report, it recommends or looks at the need to build confidence among multi kinds of actors. And Brian, you made the point that the Western models of connectivity won't get Africa connected. You were talking about the infrastructure as well, but I'm just wondering, how can you, for those that maybe are hesitant about coming online because of the feeling that it's not safe or such, what kind of actions can be taken to build confidence to encourage people to connect? Let's go for, since there's that first direct question to Scott. Let's go directly to Scott, and then maybe to Brian, and then others can jump in by raising your hand, and then also again we'll if others jump into the Q&A or chat, we'll go to another round. Scott, please.
Sure, no, and thanks very much. Great question. I think the short answer is the treaty bodies and the working group and other human rights mechanisms can provide authoritative guidance and advice to help companies and governments improve the governance frameworks around social media platforms, which is obviously a huge area of concern. The human rights mechanisms, the treaty bodies, the special procedures, the working group can provide expert advice to, I think, respond to the question of, well, we may all agree that your human rights offline apply online, but how? What does that really mean? How do the guidance coming from the treaty bodies and other human rights mechanisms, how does that really apply to governments wanting to regulate companies and to company practice and policy itself? And I'll just note that the UN has recently created a digital hub for human rights and digital technology, and this is essentially a repository of guidance coming from the treaty bodies, coming from the special procedures of the Human Rights Council and the Human Rights Council itself on how human rights do apply in the online space. So I think in short, it's that type of guidance that can be useful.
Great, thank you. Brian.
Sure. So there seem to be two questions so far, which I could address. One is around the transferability of the technology and commercial model that Mawingu has deployed to other areas, such that other people, people in other parts of the world can access connectivity for as little as 10 US cents a month. Reliable connectivity and meaningful connectivity. And then the second is around, how we work to get people online. So to the first question, the answer is yes, it is transferable. So there are organizations working in other parts of the world, many of which are a part of an initiative which Mawingu was proud to have been, I think, the first member, which is the Airband initiative, Microsoft's Airband initiative, which really is around driving connectivity and broadband to rural areas, both in the United States and outside in places such as Africa, where we are involved and a few other companies are, in South America, in Asia, in India. And a lot of those organizations make use of similar technologies, right? And so as to be concise, as Adam has asked us to do, and there's about 6 things that make up this sort of technology mix, which are indeed replicable. So one is that we use we make use of low-cost radio equipment, right? As opposed to laying fiber cables last mile, where we're making use of radio equipment that is priced in such a way that we don't transfer high prices to the customer. The second thing is that the infrastructure itself is lighter than mobile, which is to say that when you look at the density of towers that we need to deploy, it is such that once again the end price is or the end user's price is affordable. The third thing is that we can erect it in days rather than months. What that means is that the labor cost of actually erecting this infrastructure or deploying this infrastructure are low. The fourth thing is that it travels far, right? Physically, the technology that we use enables us to transmit that the signals quite far, right? Some relays we can do up to 100 kilometers on a single relay, and you can go up to five relays using the technology that we use. The fifth thing is that it requires much less power. So we run our entire infrastructure, backhaul infrastructure on solar. And then the final thing is that it operates on free bandwidth, which is unlicensed, right? Which is to say that we don't pay the high licensing costs that, for instance, mobile operators pay. And one technology that ticks all of these boxes, which we have worked with Microsoft to develop as part of the Airband initiative, is TV white spaces, right? And the use of such a technology, really it can be used anywhere, enables us to avail our internet at such affordable prices. And then just very quickly, to that second question around some of the things that we do to actually get people online. I think some of them have been touched on earlier, which is, in addition to dramatically reducing data costs for all, right? And I mean dramatically, so that those who have been excluded before no longer continue to be excluded in the drive to digitize. Some of the things that we have, some of the tools that we have explored and found that have worked are around content, which we spoke about, and also paying a lot of attention to the journey through which people discover the internet and this world of going online, and making that safe. A lot of us take for granted how we were first introduced to the internet, which might have been through an email address, getting an email address which we needed for government services or whatever, or through a Google search, right? So paying a lot of attention to the dynamics of that transition from the analog world to the digital world, or from offline to online, is something that's important if we're to make sure that once we deploy the infrastructure, that people do actually go online.
Great. Thank you so much. We have one of the questions that we haven't addressed, and I think I'd like to turn to Chris because we've got one more question here, and that is this question of the urban space, because it is very relevant to the schools. And then also as a contrast, we have the question here in the Q&A from Howard Robinson around how we define school. Are we only as defined by the state, for example, What about those informal school structures? And I think most importantly, how about the education of displaced people, refugees, and others? How is GIGA seeing that, and how do you define that within your approach? Chris, you mind taking
thanks.
that?
No, I think I would say one of the big issues with urban versus rural is that a mobile network operator makes a lot more money being in an urban area because that's where a lot of people are, and it's just much nicer for them to have a contract there. They make a lot less money putting their infrastructure out far away, and it's hard to get the loans and everything else because a lot of people don't believe that poor people are worth anything, which is not right, obviously. So when we look at the urban and rural, there's actually just a dramatically different market in these two places, and I think we have an ability to start bridging that with some of the market dynamic shaping that we've heard about on this call. I mean, when we look at a school, there are two ways to look at it. One is a school is anywhere where young people are learning. That's kind of my view of it. The other is a government school is a government school. That's a place that has a link to a Ministry of Education and so on and so on. And those can be schools in refugee camps or for displaced persons. They don't need to necessarily be in a sovereign state register, but there's another kind of thing there. GIGA looks at anything where there are kids. So we have satellite data that helps you figure out what a school is. You work with companies that are also providing services that can tell us where schools are and so on and so on. And it's like, is there a football pitch? Is there a queue of kids walking there in the morning? Are they walking back in the evening? And so on and so on. And that's a school for us. But really a school is a node. And I would just maybe end with this. A school is a physical place where you can put an access point, you can put connectivity, and you can define a community around it. And once you give that access to the school, if you have, for example, what we're testing in Rwanda, the ability to provide access outside of the school, the Wi-Fi exists outside, to provide it to health centers, to provide it to youth programs, to provide it to businesses, you can start to make a whole bunch of money that doesn't come from that public sector outlay from the Ministry of Education. So if you think about a school as what it could be, which is a node for connectivity, a node for opportunity, and a place where information can flow in a variety of ways, that's really an exciting vision of the future. And in that case, a school can be pretty much anywhere, but we need a place to start. And a lot of these connectivity initiatives don't work because they try to start everywhere. And if you try to start everywhere, you start nowhere. So at least a school is something that we can count, hopefully. We'll count all the rest of the 5 million of them. And it's something that you can put a mast on, or an access point, or a radio. And it's something that a community lives around.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this gets back in some sense to your point about we can't fix what we can't see. I mean, we really need to map out the terrain in order to understand where the connectivity is. Before we turn to John for concluding remarks, I'm wondering if Antonio has any further insights on the funding issue. We spoke about the need for innovative financing around infrastructure. Chris gave us a very interesting example looking at sort of the Gavi model. I'm wondering, are there other models of innovative financing out there from other sectors that we can look to help us to get this bridge the divide to get to universal connectivity?
Thank you very much, Adam. I would like to emphasize something that was mentioned at the very beginning by Chris regarding the importance of mapping. I think that this is like a specific area of improvement for almost every country in which we are working. The lack of data, not only in terms of where the infrastructure is, but also in terms of other utilities infrastructure is going to be instrumental to precisely identify the magnitude of the gap. And going back to your question, to define the financial model that we can put in place. That financial model could be either this thematic bond that I was mentioning, or it could be also how to properly use universal service funds. So for instance, with Chris and his team, we have been working in Honduras, where they, for instance, have a specific universal service fund, but in some occasions what is happening is that universal service fund is not pretty much aligned with the national connectivity plan. So we need to establish this sort of a linkage between those resources that are already there, the mapping that allow us to identify where is the infrastructure, where is the gap, and even how we can implement particular regulatory frameworks related to rights of ways, and then precisely the proper use of those resources, taking into account the gap that we want to attend. So I may say, to conclude, innovative financial models come along with innovative tools that allow that innovative financial model to properly work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we have one more question in the Q&A, and what I'd like to do is just pose it. It's something we've covered before, but I'd like to go back, give everyone the chance to give one final 1 minute. If you like to, you could pass on if you've said your piece, and then we'll go on to John for concluding remarks. So the question comes from Dila.Punt, and the question is, how can cultural barriers be overcome while also conveying the merits of and acting on connectivity? Some cultures, communities are still so resistant to modernization, and it has to do with transparency, a sense of privacy, or being exposed. For example, bureaucrats and LDCs who tend to be reluctant to adopting internet technology. There's a bit of a weave there about the hesitancy. I think we've been talking about everyone really wants to be connected, but there still is some questions around hesitancy. Scott, maybe we could start with you if you have anything, and then we'll go back to Chris and Brian, Antonio, and then John. How does that sound? Scott, any answer, and also any final remarks in a minute or so?
Yep, and just in a minute, I mean, I think the question goes right to the importance of inclusivity and including local communities in carrying out human rights due diligence and consulting transparently with communities that are impacted by connectivity projects. I think you'd be able to dig in to some of those very tricky issues that the person who asked the question gets at. So I would close just in looping back to the overall, I think, usefulness of human rights due diligence and carrying that out up front and during connectivity projects, and how that can really be an asset for companies such as we've seen, Microsoft invest very heavily in their own human rights processes, member states as well, and going forward, increasingly the United Nations, and how that can help us all to protect institutional integrity, identify risks up front, save money, save time, avoid reputational risks. So we're obviously a strong believer in that. And thanks again for the opportunity.
Great, thank you, Scott, so much. Chris, any 1 minute final remarks in response to the final question?
Yeah, well, I'd say, that the hesitance to use new technology. I think we just got email in the UN, a few months ago in some places, so it's not a geographic thing. If the internet isn't made for you, if it doesn't have things that you can use, if it's somebody else's internet, you don't really need to use it or want to use it or feel comfortable using it. And that's just true across the board. So if we keep trying to push other people's internet, it really doesn't work very well. If we create the mechanisms for local internets to come up, local content, local products, that's how you make a product that's both fair and usable and generous and creates more dignity for everybody, I think.
Right, thank you. And that again raises also the issue that was, I believe, raised by the ambassador early on, is also about languages, right? The diversity, need to increase the diversity of languages online as well. Brian, please, one final.
Yeah, well, it's a fantastic question, and just to illustrate, the enormity of that challenge around cultural barriers. The customer who I referred to, who we connected in Isiolo, who lives in a mud hut. One of the things that he said to our team when our team went to connect, went to review his connection, was he said, thank you so much for connecting me to the internet. You know what, I like it so much that I sometimes let my wife use it, right? Is what he said. So that highlights a cultural barrier that exists around the equality in digital participation, right? Gender equality in digital participation, right? And it really does go back to some of the things that I referenced earlier, which is in this particular case, if indeed the cultural barrier is that women shouldn't go online, how that barrier comes alive is through the lack of access to resources for women to go online. Why? Because they didn't have the resources before, so they've been excluded before in the analog world, and we need to find a way to make sure that we lower the barrier in the first place. So for participation, for them to go online, and those are all the things around reducing data costs and what have you. Affordable access is important, right? So what I'm saying is that the cultural barrier, how that comes alive is around is when it comes to cost of access. And in order for us to address it, then, once again, that goes back to what we're discussing around innovative financing models, because that's what we need in order for us to deploy infrastructure in a way that is sustainable and in a way that it enables us to give internet connectivity to this customer's wife in her own capacity, right, at an affordable price.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. That's a good good example. Antonio, any final words in just maybe 30 seconds or so? We're just about out of time, and I want to be sure to give John the floor for final remarks.
Thank you very much, Adam. Maybe just complementing a little bit what we have been mentioning before, I think that is critical, the independency of the regulators, because they are the ones defining the regulatory framework afterwards. We are talking about a digital agenda, but probably we need to talk about more national broadband connectivity plans. And finally, we need to quantify, which is the impact that digital infrastructure brings to the economic growth, productivity, and social development. Thank you.
Phenomenal. Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, we have now our closing remarks from our partner, John Frank, Vice President for United Nations Affairs at Microsoft. Thank you so much, John. Please bring this to a close. The floor is yours.
I'd like to thank everybody for participating today. I found it fascinating and very encouraging that people are working on solutions to get us there. And just kind of going back over, for me, some of the highlights, Ambassador Akram's very elegant framing of both the challenge and the opportunity, and his phrase that those who are left out are in virtual darkness. And his call for multi-stakeholder engagement, because this problem is not going to get solved by governments alone or by the private sector alone. And Ambassador Rugobiza's eloquent comments that if you're offline, you're off society. And her emphasis on inclusive economic growth and just recognizing the importance of connectivity to inclusive growth, with an emphasis on skills and in dealing with the gender issues. And from the SG's office, Ayaka Suzuki, her point very much deserves this entire project. This paper grows out of trying to build on top of what the high-level panel and the Office of the Tech Envoy have launched, and very much in cooperation with those efforts. And to kind of, Scott, I think you've captured very well. We've got to get the framing right for connectivity, and that was the challenge that I think these discussions are trying to focus on. And so we know we need to get human rights on it. We need skills. We need affordability, and we need to measure the right things. It's one thing to measure broadband coverage. It's another thing to measure usage and the equity of usage and the gender usage gaps. And Brian, I have such admiration for Mwingo. And it's a little hard to realize the depth of the social thought that's gone into creating this enterprise, and it's so inspiring. That last mile connectivity is hugely important, and the innovations that you've got with business model, but also on social programs, I think is incredibly important. And so I think that going to Antonio's point, we need to find the financing means to help companies like yours scale and reach more people. And Chris has been working on that very much. And Chris, I really appreciate your insights, and I really want to learn more about what Gig has learned that can be taken elsewhere as well. And so much agreeing that if we can't measure it, we can't fix it. We can't see it. You can't map it. Even in the United States, we've got a digital gap where we're still debating whether, there's 30 million people that aren't covered by broadband, or is it 60 million? And then we look at the actual measurement of usage. It seems there's 100 million people in the United States that don't really have full broadband access. So these problems are incredibly broad, I think that, you know, there is this opportunity to we have a moment to go try to fix things. And so the framing is important. We need we need to get this right. And I'd like to thank IPI for taking this on and helping bring together people and help drive the discussion forward and the thinking. And really just, again, just a big thank you to all for participating and for all the great work you've been doing. It's encouraging. There's still some big challenges, but you know, there's opportunity for progress. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And let me just add my thanks as well to everybody and to our panelists, to you, John, and to Microsoft. It's really been a great project, and I look forward to working further. Please watch this space. We'll continue this dialogue as time goes on. Thank you so much. Have a good day, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be. Thank you. Take care.